So you're watching an interview with the Oxford Political Review. I'm Brian Wong, the founding editor-in-chief of the Review. We're very honored to be joined by Steve Schmidt, a leading American political strategist and one of the co-founders of the Lincoln Project. Steve, it's an absolute honor and pleasure to have you with us today.
Good morning. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you. So we've got roughly 2 months to go before the big day, so to speak. And after the kicking off of the Republican convention, we've seen a general narrowing of the gap between Biden and Trump, for instance, in a morning consult poll. And the gap also seems to be closing in Minnesota and Nevada with what's some to be the side effects of both the political instability and also widespread protests and violence across the country. What do you make of Biden's chances as of today?
Well, the race will narrow as it gets closer. Voting starts in some places in just a couple of weeks. Look, you wouldn't want to trade places with Joe Biden right now. He's ahead in the race. He's ahead comfortably, significantly. He's had a longer and bigger lead than any other candidate in the modern era of American presidential politics has had at this point in the race. The election were tomorrow, Joe Biden would win. When we look at the Republican convention, it doesn't appear that Donald Trump has had much, if any, of a bounce out of it. Not a big increase in the polls. We're seeing some tightening, which is structural in the swing states. But when you look at it right now, Donald Trump is a failing president, a failed president. The United States is the epicenter of coronavirus death and suffering in the world's leading math and science country. We'll soon have more than 200,000 dead Americans. We just went over our 6 millionth case. The economy is shattered. The country is divided and at each other's throats. Trump is deliberately stoking chaos across the country to destabilize the political system in a way that's totally antithetical to the dignity of the office of the President of the United States and abhorrent to the democratic traditions of the country.
Do you think the Lincoln Project's messaging is working then in terms of reaching out to the party base of both converting independents as well as disillusioned Republican voters? And how would you measure or comment on the successes so far of the project, so to speak?
Well, the Lincoln Project has spent millions of dollars advertising in key Senate races, has played a leading role in defining the narrative of the presidential campaign. I think it's viewed in the United States as having inflicted a lot of political damage on Donald Trump with the advertising, with the distillation for the American people about what the race is about. We've seen very substantial shrinking of people describing themselves as Republicans. One of the things to understand about American politics is that as a political party shrinks, and the Republican Party is shrinking drastically and dramatically, astronomically, think of a dwarf star that's collapsing. As it collapses and its mass shrinks, its core heats up, it gets hotter. The extremism of a party emanates more brightly from a shrinking party. We're seeing that. Donald Trump has spent a lot of days attacking the Lincoln Project and the founders of the Lincoln Project and responding to things that the Lincoln Project has said, which are days that he's not involved in the fight with Joe Biden. And so we think it's been very successful on that front.
That's interesting because I think the trend or the phenomenon of partisan de-alignment and shifting away from both partisanship and declaring oneself as a Republican, as well as the poll gaps, for instance, between the two candidates. These were all signs and phenomena that we saw in 2016 between Clinton and Trump. Certainly not to the same extent or to the same degree, perhaps, as we currently see under the coronavirus, especially given the economic recession and all of that. But could you confidently say that what happened in 2016 wouldn't repeat again and recur again in November? And if so, what are the reasons for you to believe or be more confident of that fact as compared with 4 years ago?
Well, I'm not a psychic, right? So I can look back on 2016 and see if there are trend lines that are through lines, right, on the two. And what I would say about 2016 are a couple of things. And let's start with this, that Hillary Clinton was a unique candidate in American history in that she was center of the stage, famous in American life and American politics for 26 years, since 1992. There's never been a person that the country actually seriously considered making the president who has endured for that long at the center of American life. The only analogous person is Richard Nixon, who was famous for 20 years from 1948 to 1968 from the Alger Hiss case, with some years of retirement in the middle. So that was one thing. And there's good parts about that, and there's bad parts about that. The second thing, and the reality of the race was this: whomever that race was about was the person who was losing the race. And for 99% of the 2016 presidential campaign, that race was about Donald Trump until the last week when James Comey made it about Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And by the narrowest of margins, 78,000 votes across 3 states, Donald Trump pulled the inside straight and he won the election. Now, this race is fundamentally about Trump. He's the incumbent. It's his performance. Part of Donald Trump's messaging is that if Joe Biden wins, you'll see violence across America. Well, that's the violence we're seeing right now in this moment in Donald Trump's America. So the structure of the race is different. There's 2 types of elections. There's change elections and there's more of the same election. This is a change election. People do not want to keep going in the direction that we're going in this country. Donald Trump has precipitated dramatic decline in the power and the prestige of the country. He's humiliated the country. We are in a bad place 3.5 years of Donald Trump's presidency on. And the reality is he has a vociferous and loud base. There are 25 to 30% of the country that have surrendered themselves to Trump's cult of personality. It's not the majority of the country. And he's in big trouble when you look out at the electoral map right now, particularly in states that are traditionally Republican states like Georgia and Arizona and even Texas, which are very, very close.
That's a fair point. And I think obviously Trump and Pompeo are going to pull every single card that they possibly can over the next 60 days or so to get themselves back into the White House. And one potential tactic that's touted here is effectively the dog whistling against Chinese, or rather more broadly speaking, China as the bogeyman. And Trump is trying to portray Biden and certainly all of his critics as effectively extensions or cronies of the Chinese state, to which he's also attributed, by the way, the coronavirus along the way. What do you make of his scare tactic there? And do you think his dog whistling and approach there would actually succeed eventually? Or are you less, I suppose, more optimistic that it won't eventually?
Well, I think China can be a potent issue in the campaign. And when it comes to China, you know, the candidate that has delivered on Chinese policy aims more adroitly than any other American president within living memory is Donald Trump. You know, China is an ancient land. It's an ancient society, 5,000 years old, and the Chinese have had some of their best years out of all of it under the 3.5, 4 years of Donald Trump, from his withdrawal of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which ceded the Western Pacific to the Chinese for the 21st century, unless that's reversed by the next president. You look at the fundamental corruption of the administration, the Chinese issuance of patents to Donald Trump's daughter, the amount of business that Trump does in China, his stoking of this trade war, which has injured American farmers for politics and nothing more, no sensible trade policy attached to it. You know, 2 things can be true at the same time. The Chinese could have been deceptive, and which they were, over coronavirus, over COVID-19. They could have mishandled it at the beginning, failed in their obligations to the global community, which they did. And at the same time, the United States, under the Trump administration, could have profoundly mishandled the virus as well. Both things are true. And so when you look at Chinese assertion of power into the world, when you look at Chinese theft of American technology, when you look at China's crackdown in Hong Kong, there are many, many things for the United States and the Western allies to be concerned about with regard to China. And there's no doubt that the candidate that the Chinese would welcome, because he is an avatar of American weakness, would be another 4 years of Donald Trump.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about Trump here, but I want to take a step back, I suppose, because the purpose of political parties, of course, especially in the USA, I suppose, is to win. And that is to maximize not just fundraising, but also to further the incumbency of party leadership, as well as the senators and representatives, to help ensure that the given party maintains majority in the Congress and also holds on to the presidency. And I suppose that's why, in many ways, the Democratic and Republican parties are largely indistinguishable at the end of the day from the points of view of progressives on the left and so-called Tea Party libertarians on the right. And it would come to that sort of agreement that the bipartisan structure is enmeshed. In some ways or another, Trump seems to be little more than just a creature of this phenomenon, in that obviously he has a lot of deeply worrying personal flaws and a lot of deeply entrenched attributes that render him unfit for presidency. But presumably the underlying structural issues here are the fact that the bipartisan system has been so entrenched in America over the past century or so, such that he arose out of both disillusionment towards the system and also the entrenched corporate elite interests that backed him, that fundraised for him, that supported him as he rose to the top. So I guess my question here is, isn't a true antidote to Trump, or someone like Trump being able to acquire the office of the president, isn't the antidote a third party candidate, or supporting a break away from this enmeshed bipartisan system, as opposed to trying to basically dirty our hands and then get roped into that very bipartisan quagmire that produced Trump and produced many presidents like him, or maybe quite unlike him, but also like him in the establishmentarian tendencies in the past, say, 50 to 60 years?
Well, a couple of things. The two-party system in the United States has been, for most of the country's history, a stabilizing element, a moderating element, institutions that brought stability to the democracy. And those parties were geographically diverse, and they were ideologically diverse. Both parties had their fair share of liberals, moderates, conservatives in them. And that began to change about 50, 55 years ago in the mid-60s, when the civil rights and voting rights legislation was signed. And they're now much more ideologically and geographically homogenous. There is a process by which district lines are drawn in the United States that essentially means that the politicians are picking their voters as opposed to the voters picking their politicians, which is not very unhealthy. It's a process called gerrymandering. We have a broken campaign finance system. And for sure, Donald Trump is not the cause of all of these broken aspects of the American political system. He is a symptom of them. That's how Donald Trump came to power. Now, when you look at a broken system in an age of fundamental disruption, right, it has so far been the case that the two-party system has been immune from disruption, which would mean that it's about the only institution in American life that's not been profoundly changed by technology, unless to some degree it already has. Because one way to look at it is that Trump was in fact a political force from outside the two-party system. He was never a Republican. He spent most of his life as a registered Democrat, captured the Republican nomination, and then the Republican Party, and I would push back on you for a moment. the purpose of the political party is to win. That's the goal, but its purpose is to advance a platform, a set of ideas, right, that are part of the debate of perfecting the union. And that's one of the most astonishing aspects about this moment in American history in this Republican convention is the fact that there was no platform. It's simply a cult of personality, which is the most un-American of sentiments, because in the United States, we don't bend and kowtow to a cult of personality. It's a country that's built on ideas and ideals, not on fidelity to a person. And so that is a disturbing aspect of Trumpism and something that is totally contrary to the political history of the country.
But wouldn't you say that Trumpism, as you said just then, was not just a symptom perhaps, but it's also an indictment of the fact that a lot of individuals, whether it be on the left or the right, feel shut out and alienated by the two-party system, where the candidates emerge from primaries, and we look at, say, Romney versus...
True.
Yeah.
No question that's,
and given that that's the case, Trump was a wake-up call. What next for America then, apart from regulating campaign financing, which has been talked about for the past 2 decades, but not really followed through, or never really followed through, even under Obama or Bush before?
Well, Churchill had an observation that in a democracy, the people get the government they deserve. And there's a lot of truth to that. What I would say about America is that almost providentially, the right leaders have emerged at the right time in the most desperate hours. And I believe that there's a lot of resiliency in the country. The country has a lot of advantages. The country has the most competitive economic infrastructure in the world from a math, sciences, research universities perspective. A lot of things are right in America, but we have a completely dysfunctional and broken political system, and fixing it starts with firing Donald Trump in November. That's the first thing that has to happen. Nothing in this country is going to improve. Nothing is going to get better with regard to coronavirus or the economy until the fool who sits behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office is discharged from his duties after being repudiated by the American people.
Do you think the American people deserved Trump in 2016 then? Just following on from the logic that you talked about.
No, I don't think the American people deserved Trump, but the American people got Trump. He was a lawfully elected president of the United States by the narrowest of margins, and here we are. I understand how it is that Trump won, but how Trump won doesn't exculpate him in any way from his faithlessness to the American Constitution, to his desecration of the dignity of his office, the sundering of the American people, his profound incompetence and ineptitude, which has led to the deaths unnecessarily of 140,000 Americans. None of what has happened in 2020 in this country had to happen. And his conduct has been appalling for 4 years, from the dishonesty, the corruption, his assaults on our institutions, the rule of law. He is an autocratic personality. He is not a small L liberal Democrat. He does not have fidelity to the ideas or ideals of the country. And in fact, I think it's pretty clear he doesn't understand any of them. I don't say this lightly, but when you watch a news conference with Donald Trump, you see the musings of an imbecile telling people to inject household disinfectants as a cure against COVID-19. The things that come out of his mouth, if you were sitting on a commercial jetliner and the captain of the plane started talking like that, I guarantee you half the plane would jump up and run for the door and try to blow the hatch and get out of the plane on the slide. He's unfit at a profound and deep level.
He's deeply unfit, and I think you're absolutely right there, Steve. But just wanted to add on to that. The Republican Party's establishment, as you repeatedly noted in many past interviews, seems to have enabled, Trump to get away with a lot of this, whether it be in implicitly siding with him, in refusing to speak out against him, in repeatedly obstructing the admittedly futile and probably impossible impeachment proceedings from the start. But this is also a party that's presumably filled with individuals that aren't stupid, that are quite politically tactful. They know what they're doing. They know where the votes lie. They know that their political futures are to some extent tied to their supporting and bandwagoning behind Trump. So if that's indeed the case, I want to pose to you this hypothetical, which might not be pleasant, but what if Trump wins again? Would the Lincoln Project seek to, A, work actively with the Republican Party and trying to change it from within, B, trying to sort of forge a third path really as an independent partisan voice, or 3, seek to work with the Democrats and basically cross the aisle and engage independent voters in shifting them towards the Democratic Party in particularly constituencies or districts where the only viable alternative to these careerist Republicans is indeed the DNC, is indeed the Democrats.
It is a chilling thought to imagine 4 more years of Donald Trump. The Lincoln Project will remain pro-democracy advocates. We'll continue to fight for the cause of small L liberal democracy. And in that case, should Trump win, the Democratic Party will be the American vessel that believes in democracy, that believes in the rule of law, that believes in a restoration of the country's democratic values, because they will have been badly, badly damaged, if not burned to the ground over the course of the next 4 years. Now, the American system of government is ingenious, but simple in its construct, in that somebody is always watching somebody else to make sure that their power doesn't become out of whack with regard to the other essential institutions in the country. And so in the design of the country, the one thing that the founding fathers clearly never anticipated is that one of the co-equal branches of government would willingly subordinate itself to the executive branch, that it would voluntarily submit and surrender its authority and power. And it's been one of the most astonishing aspects of the Trump presidency, is to watch the Republican majority in the United States Senate and in the House of Representatives do exactly that. You have these senators have considerable institutional power, very strong constitutional authority to have put a check on Trump, and they've just chosen not to. And it is ominous when you look at the convention, what the implicit meaning of that convention was, right? You saw breathtaking lying for a week, right? Breathtaking lying, nonstop, right? You had family members, others rising at that convention with the absurd proposition that Donald Trump cares about you, cares about your family, cares about the country, but just hundreds and hundreds and thousands of lies. Then you saw utter lawlessness, right? The breaking of federal law over and over and over again as federal property, taxpayer property, was used for the advancement of a perverse partisan cause. And lastly, you saw Trump seizing the symbols of the republic, the symbols of the state, and attaching them to his movement as a partisan totem in a declaration of authority. So you have an American president basically saying to his supporters, I am the law, I am the truth, I am the state. And this can't stand in a democratic society. but he's not done it alone. He's done it with the complicity, the collaboration of the Republicans in Congress, who all opposed him at one point, who all knew better, but who suffer from great cowardice and have been unwilling to stand up and to say what they believe to be true. And we know they believe it to be true because they believed it not so long ago.
And if that's the case, is there someone that you think, as we near the end of our conversation, is there someone that you think is best suited to be, and could also viably do so, best suited to repair the Republican Party and to restore many of its original ideals and also values, especially at this critical juncture, and yet is also viable?
I'm not sure that the Republican Party is restorable. And I think that the defeat of Trumpism from American life is going to take many years. But what he's done is he has incentivized extreme elements, whether it's the QAnon conspiracy, whether it's white nationalists, whether it's noxious racist elements, whether it's gun fetishists who are praying for a second civil war dressed in Hawaiian shirts, storming state capitals. There's no accommodation to be made between the vestigial Republican Party and these people. You can't exist side by side in a coalition with these people. This must be defeated and purged from American life. He has injected a lot of poison into the country's body politic, and it will take some time to wash that poison out. But whether the Republican Party reforms or not, the question is whether it will be repudiated now. And it looks like it will be, that it's headed in that direction, because it's become a hostile and alien institution to the precepts, ideas, and ideals of the country.
Thank you very much. And just to close off our conversation, now, I'm certainly not a Trump fan, but I think one issue, or I guess one observation I'll make, is a lot of the rhetoric adopted by the anti-Trump movement in 2020 is reminiscent of the very same rhetoric that Hillary Clinton supporters, of which I counted myself and still count myself as one of them, employed, where they characterized Trump supporters as toxic, poisonous, dangerous, stupid, deplorable. And yet there's also that kind of rhetoric that ended up alienating large swathes across America, because fundamentally what was being done there was that we were calling out, but not really calling in a lot of these supporters to bring them on to the anti-Trump train or the anti-Trump bandwagon. Do you think there's a risk that the Never Trump movement 5 years ago, as you talked about in Morning Joe 5 years ago, the Stop Trump movement over these 3 years, the Impeach Trump movement a year and a half ago, and now the Never Trumpers, is there a risk that folks like ourselves or political operatives like yourself would end up alienating the very people we're trying to win over? And how do you try to circumvent that problem?
Well, certainly we're very deliberate. We're not trying to shame anybody who voted for Donald Trump in 2016. I mean, we're saying very directly that there are a lot of people who did a business deal with Donald Trump who never did a second deal with Donald Trump. You did a business deal with Donald Trump. Look where we are. We're not going to do a second business deal with Donald Trump. There's a better path. And the reality is Trump very famously said that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. Well, with 30% of the country, that's true. It's unfortunate, and that number's way too high. Now, we got to do something about that number. We gotta drain the infection. We gotta cure the fever. Number is too high. But that's not the work that you have to have accomplished before November. And the reality is, and there's a simple brutality to politics. There are more of us than there are of the Trumpists. So if we vote, he will lose. And he must lose. If you care about the country, and you care about the strength of the country, the future of the country, the prosperity of the country, the health of the country, that he must be removed, because no American in the entire history of the country who has ever been charged with responsibility has ever failed at anywhere close to the magnitude of failure that we have seen from Donald Trump. And that's why he's got to go.
Great. And with that, thank you very much for joining us. I wish you all the best with the upcoming 2 months. Thank you very much, Steve.
Sure.
We just heard from Steve Schmidt, the leading American political strategist, and we wish him the best of luck with his endeavors. Thank you all for watching. And once again, we'll be back soon with the opposite political review. Cheers and goodbye.